Hello, I'm Neil Thynde of Arun Associates, and this is Nick Huband of William J. Marshall, Structural Engineers and Architects. This is going to be the fourth of our presentations, and we're going to be discussing matters concerning adjacent excavation works under the Party Wall Act. Now, first of all, I need to explain how the Act works in this regard, because a neighbour is going to be carrying out, or the building owner is going to be carrying out adjacent excavation works within 3 metres or 6 metres of an adjoining property, and that very much depends on how deep the foundation is in relation to the neighbour's property. So there's various rules under the Party Wall Act, and you can check our blog posts on this, which explain how the rules work. I would like to know from you, Nick, is what risks are posed by the operations of adjacent excavations. So if you can just kickstart things off, just explaining that.
Well, the first thing you need to do is to avoid undermining the adjoining owner's foundations. It's quite easy with modern buildings. If the neighbour's house is built from 1970s onwards, the foundations are going to be moderately deep, and you can build down alongside them to a reasonable depth without any risk of undermining them. If you're next to a terrace, let's say Victorian properties, where the foundations may be 225 millimetres deep, built on a lick and a promise basically, they're very vulnerable to any disturbance by joining excavations. And this is where the engineer has to be extremely careful. And the best way to do it is to actually set back your foundations so that you're sufficiently clear from the adjoining owner's property to avoid this risk of underpinning. And you can do that by building your foundations a safe distance away, and then perhaps cantilevering out beams or slabs to support your wall on the boundary.
Okay, so that's a situation, and I was looking to explain that in the next module. In fact,
sorry.
No, that's okay. Where you're going to be building right next to a neighbour's property, and that has particular concern, structurally, in terms of you're building really close by, and how that can undermine a neighbour's property. But let's say you're not immediately next door, so there's a bit more of a gap. Let's say there's a gap of 1 metre or more, greater than that. Yeah. Now there's different types of excavations, I believe, that can take place. I mean, you could be having a hand dug excavation, say for a shallow trench foundation. You could have a deeper dug foundation with machine dug, or you can have a form of excavation like piling work carried out next door. So the risk, I would imagine, is greater if you're going deeper with your excavations, I take it, in proximity to the neighbour's property.
I mean, you've actually just set out nicely the order of risk. The least risk is hand dug foundations, little risk of vibration, quite shallow, down to about 1 metre or so. Beyond that, things start getting more complicated, and you bring your digger in. But again, these days, with lightweight diggers, there's going to be minimal disturbance to the ground, minimal vibration. And these sort of foundations down to perhaps about 3 metres or so, it's economical to use trench fill. Of course, you have to be aware of the 3 and 6 metre rules and ensure that those foundations to that depth aren't undermining the adjoining owner's foundations. If they do, then this is where things start to get slightly complicated and there's risk of movement. But moving on to piles now. Piles are more difficult because naturally you're removing soil from the ground and you're replacing it with concrete to a reasonable depth, perhaps 12 metres, perhaps 15 metres or so, and the ground will adjust itself. The gap between you taking the the ground out and filling it with the concrete, the ground will compress slightly. There is then a risk of slight movement to the adjoining owner's properties.
Right. So there will be some pressure bearing on adjoining owner's property, potentially, as a result of piling work, for example, being undertaken close by.
But not so much pressure, actually, there's almost a loss of support from the ground beneath the adjoining owner's property. Right. As the ground shrinks away slightly, moves into the piles, the ground beneath will drop very, very slightly. But there's a risk, and that can be calculated. And the engineer can make an assessment and draw a little contour plan of the likely predicted movements of the adjoining owner's property.
Okay. So a design engineer, like any building project, will be engaged, and the design engineer will come up with a foundation scheme design. So let's take a deep basement excavation next door is unlikely to be a case of just hand digging and supporting the ground. It could be, but invariably it's more a pile type retaining wall structure.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
to hold the ground up.
Either using concrete piles or sometimes even steel sheet piles.
Right.
For example, you can do it in a number of different ways, but it's very much an engineered solution. Then you have to have an engineer on board. You have to have, I think, very much in these cases, a single controlling mind. The engineer will design it, will make sure the contractor's temporary works are sufficiently strong. Because after all, if you're digging a basement out, you've got to hold the ground up. And you've got to then make sure that the props, the shoring, are sufficiently stiff. So again, the ground doesn't move slightly as the piles, the temporary walls, whatever, take up the load.
Yeah, so it really does need very careful thought in terms of the building operation and all the temporary supports that need to be in place at different stages of that excavation.
Very much so. The interaction between the temporary and the permanent works are quite key.
Right.
And for example, sometimes we actually have used dynamic shoring where the shoring picks up any movement and hydraulic jacks within the shores push back against the soil. For example, we had a 14th century church in the City of London where it was critical that no movement occurred. And there, the shoring and the props for the church wall pushed back against the church so that no movement at all happened.
That's clever technology in place.
That's very sophisticated for very, very sensitive buildings.
Okay. That obviously quite a considerable cost for building owners to take on board. In most domestic situations, I mean, I think of the suburban parts of London, it's going to be just excavations, probably hand dug in the main, but there might be a mini digger digging for the foundations of an excavation next door. There is always a risk. You know, as you rightly say, I mean, that excavation work could potentially affect maybe drainage, which is close by.
Yes.
You know, if that's on a shallow drainage, if the bedding of that drainage that supports that drain isn't very, very sound.
It's old brittle clay pipes, you know.
Right.
These things, they can happen. But normally, since the drainage is jointed, it can accommodate perhaps the movement a little bit better than perhaps a brittle wall.
Right.
Or even the wall itself may adjust itself. Particularly in London, we have soft bricks, old lime mortar, that can shrug its shoulders and adjust quite well to movements. But it can be then reflected with cracking in plasterwork on the inside.
Right. Okay. Going back to piling again, so we explained to the ordinary layperson out there what piles are.
Yeah.
Basically, do you want to just explain what a pile is so they can get on the predominantly two different types of pile that you have? Yeah.
I mean, in principle, first of all, a pile is a way of taking the load from the ground down to a suitable bearing stratum, down to something strong enough to carry the load. There are two main sorts of piles we use. They are driven piles, which are analogous to hammering a nail into the ground. They're simply hammered into the ground. Naturally, that will cause a lot of vibration and disturbance, so they're not very commonly used in London. And other various sorts of augured piles, where essentially you're corkscrewing a hole into the ground, removing the earth and replacing it with concrete. These tend to cause much less vibration. They're much more commonly used in London.
Yes. And with those, obviously, there's, as you explained earlier on, there could be a shrinkage or movement of soil away from the adjoining owner's property.
Yes, that's right.
As a result of this operation that could take place.
Yes.
Now, one of the concerns would be from a neighbouring viewpoint is, well, I don't really want there to be a loss of support underneath the foundation of my property. Right. You know, what would be done to mitigate the risk? You know, what sort of measures could be put in place to prevent that from occurring?
Basically, it's just looking at the sequence of the piling, avoiding too much work being done in one go and one position, trying to spread the disturbance along the property. No matter what happens in London, people build next to each other and there will always be a risk of disturbance. The idea is that with careful design to minimise that risk and for the engineer to be very sure about what likely movements are to occur to the neighbour's property. And if they're too serious, they may have to then come back with a different design, move the piles away, come up with a different sequence of construction, and so on. But there is always risk. It's the penalties for living in London.
Okay. But generally with any town or any city, I would say you need to consider the risk of adjacent excavations there.
Yes.
Now, there's there's a driven pile and the corkscrew auger pile.
Yes.
Now, I would imagine because of the risk of hammering something into the ground and the fact the ground could shake and vibration, you're less likely to be using the driven pile where there is a build-up of property in the area, then I would imagine. Is that right?
Absolutely. Often they're found on greenfield sites because they're quite economical to put in. But yes, I agree, they're anathema in a built-up area. The vibrations can be, frankly, quite fearsome if they get it wrong.
Right. And I suppose what the design engineers also take into consideration are the soil types within the ground as well, and they'll decide what type of pile would be used in that operation.
Exactly. London is on basically on clay, but there are areas of gravel, and gravel is not forgiving with driven piles. Hammering driven piles into gravel, and you can cause not only vibration that will really disturb the neighbours, which can actually cause structural damage.
Right. Okay. In regards to monitoring properties next door, what would you say? Would that be normally in a more larger, complex type project? Would you say you need to do some sort of movement monitoring and vibration monitoring checks?
Yes, I mean you always want to be aware of what's happening to the adjoining owner's property, and with any significant works, the engineer will have a calculated assessment of likely movements, and often that's minimal, and you need very little monitoring, perhaps just the engineer on site making sure that everything's not moving, simple checking levels and so on and so forth. For more sophisticated projects where there is a risk of large movements or you have to be careful, you can go to full spectrum monitoring, which can be as simple as telltales across existing cracks, which will pick up any movement. Movement's always concentrated in existing cracks. It prefers to use something that's already broken rather than breaking new structure. So they're a good starting point. And you go from there to DMAC gauges. Of course, you've seen the DMAC gauges, the two steel studs across a crack and a very sensitive caliper to measure the gap between the two. And you then move on perhaps to targets mounted on the walls. These are those little square panels you sometimes see on buildings where somebody will then set their measuring instruments on that, and they will be able to accurately predict movement of that target, both in terms of planar movement and up and down movement. Okay. And that can be done either regularly by the site engineer, for example, or you can now have automatic systems that monitor in real time.
Yes, I understand. And also you could have a situation if there's a major demolition of an adjoining property, for example. You might want to have movement monitoring put in place then.
Yes, that's right. And sometimes in those cases vibration monitoring too, because cutting away over existing structures can actually generate quite significant vibrations which can pass through the ground, often in quite a strange and anomalous manner. A neighbour might not have a problem, but the chap across the road might have a problem because of the characteristics of the subsoil. And normally these aren't sufficient to cause damage to the building, but sufficient to cause upset to the owners. And that's where you're looking at different types of techniques. You're looking at perhaps hydraulic braking. You're not looking at just hammering away at a Kango.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you for that. Thank you. This has been a presentation by Arun Associates, Chartered Surveyors and Property Consultants, in conjunction with William J. Marshall and Partners, Structural Engineers and Architects. As the building owner, please be aware that you will need to comply with all statutory regulations, including complying with party wall legislation, building regulation and planning requirements. I hope this presentation has been of value to you, and if you have any further issues regarding your building project, or if you are a neighbour that might be affected by building works which your neighbour is intending to undertake, please do not hesitate to contact us. Thank you.